rolling, and then audio, you say sound.
Sound.
And then ready, and then.
Hi, what's your name?
Paul McIntosh, good afternoon.
And how are you today?
I'm fine, how are you?
I'm good. Where were you born?
I was born in Augusta, Georgia.
And what was your childhood like growing up in Georgia?
It was not unlike the typical Southern childhood for a young black man. I was in a situation that was in the throes of some obvious racism and some poverty. And those circumstances compelled me and my family to do some things that one would not normally do. For example, I picked cotton. There was a time when I worked on various farms. It was primarily a kind of agrarian community that was unfortunately characterized by some blatant racism and some pretty negative attitude towards people of color.
Okay, and how long did you live in Georgia?
I lived in Georgia until I was 18 years old. I left to go to college. Of course, my family, my mother, father, and my extended family being in Georgia, it's my point of origin and the point where I always return.
While in Georgia, did you learn about poetry?
Of course. I grew up in the black church, and preachers, they're the griots that have such a command of language that I think is a part of that fertile ground that all poets come from. So for me, the first poets were those preachers and ministers who were artists of language. They used language well. They used metaphor. They used simile. They used hyperbole. Not unlike the rappers and some of the poets that followed or that are part of that poetic tradition. So yes, I did experience poetry, but initially it was in the church. And of course, being in Sunday school, you would have those occasions when you would be required to maybe recite a poem, and you might hear or might be required to recite some Robert Frost. You might take some verses from the Bible. I can remember, in fact, Ecclesiastes, the 3rd chapter, it began, "To everything there's a season and a time and purpose to everything under the heavens, a time to be born and a time to die." That language from the Bible was some of the first poetry that I heard.
Okay, and did you stay in Georgia?
I stayed in Georgia all of my life, went to school in Georgia. In fact, the first school that I attended was a school called Doutry Elementary School, and it had an open ditch running alongside a wooden building. And I remember every morning I had to walk about 1.5 miles to that school, and one of the things that I had to do was to stoke a pot-bellied stove with coal and wood that we had to chop. And it was a 4-room school. And you had virtually all of the grades from grades 1 through, at that time, 6th in those four rooms. And as I said, there was an open ditch that ran alongside it. We lived sort of in the valley, and the white people lived sort of like up on the higher elevation, and this stream ran down through where the black people lived. So we would get the refuse and the debris that would come down in this stream. And I remember vividly, there was a lady by the name of Ms. Peterson, and every day at 12 during recess, she would get a biscuit and put a piece of jelly in it, because my parents really didn't have any money. Some jelly, and put it into a biscuit, and she would wrap it up in a piece of newspaper or whatever she would have, and she would throw it across the ditch, and I would have to catch it, and that would be my lunch. We weren't allowed to leave the school ground proper. So she, every day, routinely, 12 o'clock, I'd be out in the schoolyard, and she would wrap that little biscuit, and she would throw it to me, and that's how I grew up. But it made me appreciate life, and it gave me the opportunity to sit here and look at brothers and sisters like you, and and realized that those struggles and the ambitions and the love that those who came before me had for me was not in vain.
Would you say over time all of this has changed for good or worse?
Well, some of the blatant racism that exists in the South obviously has changed. We're able to sit in places where we couldn't sit before. When I was a kid, I remember after picking up cotton, I should say, we would bring those bales of cotton to be weighed at the farmer's market. And you might have a fountain marked colored and another one marked white. And under the pain of being beaten up or really abused, you would not violate that rule which said that, you know, you could not drink out of that white fountain. There were colored signs, even outhouses, bathrooms. If you went into a white bathroom, you were in trouble. And as a kid, I was always kind of defiant. And I don't want you to think that I'm some old man. I really am not. I'm talking about something that's quite recent. I was always very defiant. So I would go and purposely drink out of that white fountain, or purposely go into that white-only bathroom. And my parents, they used to pray for me a lot because they thought that somebody was going to really, hurt me. But all that did was to light a fire in my heart. It made me even more determined not to be defined and treated badly the way that traditionally black people have been treated in the South.
Up until what age did you live in Georgia?
I left Georgia at the age of 18 when I was accepted into college. The first member of my family to go to college, I might say.
And where was that college located?
That college was in Boston, well, Lowell, Massachusetts, about 20 miles south of Boston.
Have you lived in any other places or parts of New York?
When I first came to New York, I lived in Bedford-Stuyvesant. I lived in the Bronx for a very brief time, but the majority of the time that I've been in New York was spent right here in Harlem.
And can you reflect on Harlem pop culture at the time when you first moved into Harlem?
When I came to Harlem, it was the age of Michael Jackson. Of course, it also was the age of James Brown. I mean, me being sort of an R&B kind of a person, steeped in that tradition of the blues, but also having a love and affinity for jazz. It was a milieu, an environment that pretty much, as I said, embraced and was defined by that whole Michael Jackson energy. But having some sense of where I was, I knew that this was where Chick Webb lived and played at the Savoy Ballroom. I knew that this was where Connie's Inn was. I knew that this was where Minton's Playhouse still is. I knew that this was where Duke Ellington and Count Basie and Fats Waller and Ethel Waters and all those brothers and sisters were the architects of a very unique culture, a culture that I am a product of, a culture that defined who and what we are.
If you had to compare Harlem pop culture to now, what would be the change?
Well, if you permit me, for just a minute, I'd like to kind of frame that a little bit. When I think of Harlem, I think of the people who came to Harlem during the period of the Harlem Renaissance. Shortly after World War II, for decades, in fact, after World War II, large numbers of black people left the agrarian and depressed southern communities in which they lived, and they came north. And they settled in places like Chicago and Pittsburgh and Newark, New Jersey, and Philadelphia, and of course here in Harlem. So when you look at Harlem from the period of, say, 1919 to maybe 1940, that was considered the Harlem Renaissance. And the Harlem Renaissance is really the foundation for all of this music, even hip-hop. If you bear with me for a second, I'd like to run it down like this. During the Harlem Renaissance, it was probably the most intense period for black culture and activity, if not the world, certainly in this country. You had people like Marcus Garvey and the Universal Negro Improvement Association. I mean, you had people like Zora Neale Hurston. You had people like Rudolph Fisher. You had poets like Countee Cullen. You had people like James Weldon Johnson, who wrote Lift Every Voice and Sing. You had people like Gene Toomer, who wrote Cain. And these brothers and sisters, Georgia Douglas Johnson, for example, Janie Fawcett, these brothers and sisters decided that they wanted to create or embrace a new kind of aesthetic, an aesthetic that was black. Because up until that point, the poets and writers and much of that energy personified and reflected a Eurocentric aesthetic. But Langston Hughes and Gene Toomer and Zora Neale Hurston and all of these writers decided that they wanted to create a black aesthetic. This aesthetic said that I'm black and I'm proud of being black. And it's fine if you accept that, but it's who we are and that's who we're going to be. Should I stop or?
No, you're fine. I wanted to make sure we weren't
Oh,
going
okay, okay.
Oh, you're good. You're good.
Good.
Lauren? You can do the medical service.
So these individuals decided that they wanted to create a sort of a black aesthetic. And this aesthetic said, you know, I'm black and I'm proud. This is who I am. And it's good if you accept me that way. But if you don't, I'm going to be black and proud anyway. So they set the foundation for the energy that was to follow. So then you had people like Langston Hughes. And you had people like Sterling Brown, but in particular, someone like a Gil Scott-Heron. And Gil Scott-Heron, he would write pieces like The Revolution Would Not Be Televised, or an album that he did called 125th Street, Small Talk at 125th Street. And these individuals reflected much of the civil rights movement. They were very adamant and aggressive in their pronouncements about who and what they were. So you fast forward the 60s with that energy that they created, and you look at, again, the foundation. Gil Scott-Heron and the Last Poets, they built on the Langston Hugheses and the Sterling Browns and the James Weldon Johnsons. And then you had rappers like Common and NWA and all those brothers who built on the tradition of the Last Poets and Gil Scott-Heron. In fact, Common and you have people like Tupac. All those brothers and sisters, if you talk to them, they will tell you that they were influenced and their foundation comes from Gil Scott-Heron or the Last Poets, who are considered the godfathers of rap. The Last Poets, in fact, began in Marcus Garvey Park in the 60s, which is not too far from here. So in thinking about this tradition, I have to reflect on its history and its origin, going back to the Langston Hugheses and the James Weldon Johnsons and the Margaret Walkers. And you follow that tradition all the way up to the Gil Scott-Herons and the Last Poets. And that tradition continues with the rappers and the hip-hop artists that I just mentioned, with Common, you know, with NWA, with Master P, with Tupac. So that's the kind of continuum, the kind of circle that, if truth be told, pardon me, is the origin of what you call hip-hop, what you call rap. For example, I mean, just bear with me for a second. The Last Poets, before anybody was doing this, they would say things like, just because you're black. Just because you're black. You say you don't want to die because I don't want to die because. You say you don't want to die because there's no cause to die for. Now, what would cause you to say that? But see, those brothers are rapping like that. And when Common and Public Enemy and all those rappers, when they heard this was kind of new to them. And that is really the genesis of what we call hip-hop.
Referring back to Langston Hughes, has any other poets influenced your view on poetry today?
Besides Langston Hughes, has any other poet influenced?
Your view on poetry?
There's so many. I mean, there really are. When I think of like Sterling Brown, I think of Nikki Giovanni. When I think of some of the stuff that, I mean, look at what Common writes. You look at Lupe. There's just so many. Well, I think of Sterling Brown, for example. He kind of summarizes much of the tradition out of which you come. And just to give you a line or two, he wrote a piece called Strong Men. And he says, they dragged you from homeland. They chained you in coffles. They huddled you spoon fashion in filthy hatches. They sold you to give a few gentlemanese. They broke you in like oxen. They scourged you. They branded you. They made your women breeders. They swelled your numbers with bastards. They taught you the religion they disgraced. In that piece, because the brother's refrain is, the strong men keep a coming on. It runs down that long history of a people being taken from their homeland and being stripped of their culture and being abused and misused. But despite all of that, the strong men and women keep a coming on. So yeah, there are many poets.
Have you seen any of these poets perform in Apollo?
You know, it's funny. When I got to New York, the Apollo was not the Apollo that it was when it was in its heyday. So I didn't get to see anybody at the Apollo until the 80s, and I never saw any of those poets. Although I did see Parliament Funkadelic, and I had a chance to see James Brown after he was a little bit older, and I saw, if you consider, and he is a poet, Smokey Robinson. So I saw those poets, those brothers and sisters who sang.
If given the opportunity, would you go see poets perform then?
Of course. Poets are the musicians of the soul. And the first expressions of music, they were poets. Shakespeare was a poet before he was anything else. I often think that when man first began to move across the earth, he might have walked out and saw a glorious sky or saw the moon, and he looked up, and it was so overwhelming until he expressed that beauty and that awe-inspiring moment through poetry. So poetry is the first language. It's the first music.
If poetry was the first language, what poem or poet symbolizes it most?
Oh, wow. That's a very, very difficult question, because so many poems and poets come to mind. It's funny. When I think of poetry, I think of course, Langston Hughes. He is perhaps the best known poet from that era, from the era of the Harlem Renaissance, all the way to the 60s. In fact, he died in the 60s, I think 68. But he lived right here in Harlem all of his life. Well, one of the things that kind of endears me to Langston is his ability to use language in so many ways. For example, when he was trying to speak to sort of a jazz idiom or music, he wrote a poem called Dream Boogie, and he simply says, "Good morning, Daddy. Ain't you heard the boogie woogie rumble of a dream deferred? Listen closely, you'll hear their feet a beating out, a beating out. Do you think that's a happy beat? Listen to it closely. Don't you heard something underneath like a, what did I say? Sure, I'm happy. Take it away. Hey, pop, rebop, mop, yeah." Can you hear the music in that? See, Langston was just that kind of a poet. But one of the things that really endears me to him is something that he said in a magazine called Nation. And it was written, if memory serves me correctly, or published, I should say, in 1926, 27. And he was being interviewed, and the question had to do with the Negro artist and the racial mountain. And he was lamenting the fact that there was a very promising poet that was asked, how did he want to be remembered, or how would he define himself? And he said, you know, I don't want to be considered a Negro poet. And when he said that to Langston, he thought that, or he believed that this young man didn't have a true understanding of who he was, because he thought that the young man was saying, this very promising poet was saying, well, if I don't want to be remembered as a Negro poet, I want to perhaps subconsciously be remembered as a white poet. And if I want to be remembered as a white poet, perhaps I want to be a white person. And he felt that that was tragic, because any poet, any person, be they white, black, whatever, if you don't embrace who you are, you can never embrace your greatness. So Langston always believed in dealing with the race question and dealing with the fact that he was a poet of color, and that he should be proud of that. So that is one of the reasons that he comes to mind. But I could also talk about, you know, the last poets, or Gil Scott-Heron. You know, the last poets oftentimes expressed in very graphic and very poignant details that internal energy that makes us who we are. In fact, just to give you a line from the last poets, and sometimes they could be considered kind of radical, but I remember a few lines from a poem. I don't even remember the name of the poem now, but it was a long piece, but it began like this. I am a black verse. I am the thought of all things, thinking of wishing for something to come true. I am the wish and the wishbone that white people break for good luck, and the next day one of them falls and breaks their neck. I am the wish that makes the Clairol lady wish she had the body of Cleopatra, the voice of Billie Holiday, the sexiness of Eartha Kitt, and the afro of Abbey Lincoln, for then she would be truly beautiful. Anyway, those brothers were saying some radical things, and I'm not commenting on whether I was agreeing with what they were saying, but this was a period during the 60s when black people were being having dogs sicked on them by Bull Connor, and they were being hosed, and they couldn't vote. We couldn't vote. Little girls were being bombed in places like Birmingham, Alabama. It was a very intense time. Martin Luther King was marching. Malcolm X had been killed. So in response to all of that negativity that had been heaped historically on black people, you had brothers like the last poets being very defiant, saying, this is who I am, and this is how I feel. I'm proud of who I am. So there's so many poets so many writers. I think of Nikki Giovanni. And I've already referenced people like Sterling Brown, Margaret Walker. There are any number of poets that I think were the architects of an idiom that really has allowed us to be who and what we are. Now I can walk down the street with a brother or sister. We can create a rainbow more easily now. Then, if you were a person of color, you had a much more difficult time. But because of the struggle of those brothers and sisters, the world is fuller, and it more realistically represents who and what we are.
Growing up with poets during that time of history, would you say that influenced you to be the person you are today?
Oh, of course. I mentioned in response to your earlier question that much of the poetry that I originally heard was in the church. And there's a brother by the name of James Weldon Johnson who I mentioned earlier also wrote what is called the Negro or Black National Anthem, Lift Every Voice and Sing. But he wrote a book called God's Trombones. And in this book he tries to capture the black preacher or the black minister. So one of the first sermons that I heard dealt with creation, taken from the book of Genesis. And what he wanted to do was to depict or describe or give you the language or the rhythm of that preacher, but he wanted you to be able to understand that preacher even if you were in Russia. So he didn't write it in sort of like the southern dialect that preachers typically spoke in. But he still wanted to give you a sense of that flavor, that energy. So if you were sitting in, as I said, in Russia, you could get a sense of what the aesthetics of that preacher were about. And he wrote things like, he might say something like, and God stepped out on space, and he looked around and said, I'm lonely. I'll make me a world. And as far as the eye of God could see, darkness covered everything, blacker than 100 midnights down in a cypress swamp. Then God smiled, and the light broke, and the darkness rolled up on one side, and the light stood shining on the other. You see, that sermon, written in a language that anybody who could understand plain English, as opposed to that dialect that the typical Southern preacher might speak in, served to give you the flavor of the poetry that I first heard when I was a little kid. You know, I can think of the Songs of Solomon. I mentioned earlier Ecclesiastes. But all of that language and hearing the metaphors and the similes and hyperbole, and how language was used and how those words were put together, the music of those words gave me my first real sense of what poetry was about. The blues, all of that. So yes.